Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, all the way to a place you think you know. A place of marble temples and wise philosophers. We're going to ancient Greece. A world that seems so familiar from the movies and textbooks. But trust me, it's a place you probably wouldn't last a single day in. Imagine yourself right now, standing on a dirt road in Athens. The midday sun beating down on your bare head. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. Smoke from cooking fires. And something else. Something less pleasant. A scent that reminds you that sanitation, as we know it, is a few thousand years away. You're looking up at the majestic Parthenon, a dazzling white in the sunlight. But your sandals are already caked in mud and animal droppings. The chatter around you is in a language you only vaguely understand. A sing-song of sharp consonants and flowing vowels. You feel a fly land on your arm and you swat it away. But 100 more seem to take its place. This isn't the clean, pristine world of postcards, it's a living, breathing, and frankly, quite messy reality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a treat to see just how far this little corner of the internet reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first reality check arrives not in the form of a minotaur or a gorgon, but in the basic mechanics of survival. You're thirsty, but the public fountains are not exactly sparkling clean. And even the wine, which is watered down as a matter of course, feels like a risky proposition. You notice the people around you. Their faces weathered and their hands calloused, moving with a purpose you don't yet understand. The streets aren't paved, and every step kicks up dust that clings to your skin. This isn't just about a lack of Wi-Fi or air conditioning. It's a fundamental disconnect from the physical comforts you take for granted. The sheer effort of existence. Of finding food and water that won't make you sick. Of navigating a social landscape where your very worth is determined by your family name or lack thereof. Is an exhausting business. A mainstream historical fact you'll quickly learn is that the average life expectancy for a man in ancient Athens was only around 45 years. Women, due to the dangers of childbirth, often had an even shorter lifespan. This isn't just a number, it's a constant, low-level pressure that informs every decision. You don't plan for retirement. You plan for survival. Then there are the smaller, stranger details, like the fact that some Greeks believed that crocodiles wept while eating their victims. A belief so widespread that it gave rise to the phrase, crocodile tears, long before anyone knew what a crocodile actually was. Or how the most common form of public record wasn't on paper or papyrus, but on whitewashed wooden boards, known as pinaques, which were set up in the agora for all to see. You'd have to physically go to the public square to read the latest announcements. A task as tedious as scrolling through endless pop-up ads on your phone. Historians still argue whether the concept of Greek tragedy was meant to be purely cathartic or if it served a deeper political purpose. A way to gently critique the powerful without inciting a riot. As you stand in the agora, the central marketplace, you notice a group of men gathered in a lively debate. Their voices are loud and passionate. The air smells of baking bread and something else, maybe a freshly tanned hide. You realize that this place, for all its discomforts, is alive in a way you've never experienced. It's a sensory overload, and you haven't even had your first meal yet. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the stone and dirt, and you start to feel the cool evening air. You look for a place to rest, but you quickly realize that privacy is a luxury few can afford. You're never really alone here. The sun has set, and your first night in ancient Greece has arrived. You find yourself in a small, cramped room, with a clay lamp casting flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls. The bed is a simple mat on the floor, and you can feel the grime of the day clinging to your skin. This is your first major hurdle, personal hygiene. You quickly realize that the concept of a shower with running water, soap, and hot water is so alien it might as well be from another planet. You try to wipe the dust off your face with a scrap of cloth, but it just seems to smear. It's a bit like trying to clean a window with a muddy rag. It just gets worse. You'll find that a mainstream historical fact about ancient Greek hygiene is that they used oil, not soap. When it was time for a bath, you would first cover your body in olive oil. After a while, you would use a curved metal scraper, called a strigil, to scrape off the oil, along with the dirt, sweat, and dead skin. It sounds a bit like an ancient spa treatment, but it was probably more like a cross between a car wash and a full body wax. You can only imagine the satisfying, yet gross, sensation of peeling off a layer of yourself. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might discover is that for bad breath, which you'd certainly have after a day of garlic and strong wine. Some Greeks chewed on a type of gum made from mastic tree resin. It was a simple solution to a very common problem, especially since toothbrushes and toothpaste were still a long way off. You can imagine the look of a modern dentist if they saw your teeth after a month here. You'd probably be their most interesting and most challenging patient. The sheer lack of effective dental care means that most people, even the wealthy, suffered from painful cavities and gum disease. Historians still argue whether the Greeks' relatively low sugar intake from their diet was offset by the damage caused by grinding grains in stone mills, which left tiny bits of grit in their bread, slowly wearing down their teeth. So, while you're trying to figure out how to clean your face, your gums are probably already starting to feel a bit tender. The public baths are a whole other story. They're not just about getting clean, they're social hubs. A combination of a gym, a spa, and a coffee shop, all without the coffee. You'd go there not only to scrape the grime off but also to chat, to hear the latest gossip, and to conduct business. The atmosphere would be filled with the sounds of splashing water, scraping strigils, and lively conversation. It's a place where you'd see everyone, from the lowliest laborers to the most respected philosophers, all covered in oil and dirt, ready for their daily ritual. The Greeks didn't have deodorant, but they did use perfumes and scented oils to mask body odor. You would be dousing yourself in a floral scent, trying to hide the fact that you hadn't had a proper wash in days. It's a bit like putting a fresh coat of paint on a rusty car. It looks better for a moment, but the underlying problem is still there. As you try to fall asleep, you can still smell the mix of sweat, olive oil, and scented perfume on your skin. The air is still and humid, and the sounds of the city have quieted down, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant braying of a donkey. You feel an itch on your arm and you can't help but wonder what exactly just bit you. You're definitely not in Kansas anymore. And remember that thick dust you kicked up in the agora? It's not just on your feet anymore. It's in your hair, in your clothes, and it seems to have made a permanent home on your skin. Your modern sensibilities are screaming for a long, hot shower, but all you have is a basin of lukewarm water and that trusty olive oil. You could almost hear a tiny little voice in your head, a voice that sounds suspiciously like your mom, telling you to wash behind your ears. But with what? The best you can do is smear yourself with oil and hope for the best. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder that the basic comforts we take for granted are the product of thousands of years of innovation. As you lie there, trying to get comfortable on your mat, you realize that tomorrow will bring a new set of challenges, a new layer of dirt, and another day without a proper wash. Sweet dreams. You wake up, still a bit stiff from the floor mat, and the smell of the street is already drifting through the open doorway. Your stomach rumbles, a very modern and demanding rumble, and you realize that food is your next great challenge. You're not just hungry, you're facing a culinary landscape that is utterly alien to your modern palate. The most mainstream historical fact you'll learn about ancient Greek food is that the diet was surprisingly limited and repetitive. The Mediterranean triad of bread, olives, and wine formed the core of every meal. You'd likely eat a type of flatbread, made from barley or wheat, which was a staple so important it was sometimes used as a plate. Think of it less as a fluffy artisan loaf and more as a dense, coarse, and probably a little gritty disc. You dip it in olive oil, a substance so central to life here that it was used for cooking, fuel, and bathing. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Greeks had a penchant for a fermented fish sauce called garum. This wasn't just a fancy condiment, it was a powerful, pungent flavor enhancer made from the guts of fish, left to ferment in the sun for months. It was a bit like the ancient equivalent of ketchup or soy sauce. Something you'd put on everything to make it more palatable. You can only imagine the smell. It probably wasn't a gentle, savory aroma. It was more of a stand back and hold your nose kind of scent. And while the Greeks did consume some cheese and vegetables, meat was an incredibly rare luxury, reserved mostly for religious festivals and sacrifices. You wouldn't be grilling a steak on the weekend. Instead, you'd be lucky to get a small portion of sacrificial meat after a big public ceremony. It was less a feast and more of a ceremonial ration. Your first meal of the day is a simple one, likely a piece of bread and some olives. You drink a cup of wine, but you find it's been watered down so much that it's more of a weak grape juice than anything else. A joke from back then would be that only barbarians drank their wine undiluted. The idea of drinking a full-bodied red from a bottle is seen as uncivilized and a bit dangerous, since it was believed to lead to a lack of self-control. It's a bit like a modern parent telling their teenager to only drink light beer. Historians still argue whether the Greeks' practice of watering down wine was purely for health reasons, or if it was a cultural display of moderation and sophistication. You'd be sipping your watered-down wine and trying to make conversation with a local, who would likely be talking about the latest philosophical debate or the price of barley. Breakfast, or akritisma, was often a simple affair. Maybe a piece of barley cake dipped in wine. Lunch, ariston, was usually more bread and olives, perhaps with a fig or some lentils. The main meal of the day, deipnon, was eaten in the evening and would be the most substantial, but still heavily plant-based. You'd eat with your hands, and the idea of a fork would seem as strange to them as the idea of a self-driving car. Your digestive system, accustomed to a diet of processed foods and high-quality protein, would be in for a shock. You'd be consuming vast quantities of roughage, and your stomach would probably stage a mini rebellion. You might find yourself missing the simple pleasure of a hamburger or a pizza. Things that are so commonplace now but would be utterly incomprehensible to a person in ancient Athens. As you chew on a hard piece of bread, you can feel the grit from the millstone on your teeth, a sensation you'll have to get used to, because it's in every bite. Your modern diet is a distant, delicious memory, with your stomach now quieted by a few olives and a piece of hard bread. You turn your attention to the next great challenge, clothing. Your modern attire, maybe a t-shirt and jeans, would be an immediate and shocking sign that you are a foreigner. A metoikos, or worse, you would have to quickly adapt to the local dress code. The most mainstream historical fact about ancient Greek clothing is its simplicity. Both men and women wore a simple tunic, called a chiton. For men, it was a piece of fabric, usually wool or linen, that was folded and pinned at the shoulders and cinched at the waist with a belt. It was comfortable and practical, perfect for the warm climate, but it offered little in the way of variety or personal expression. You would be walking around in what is essentially a long, shapeless garment, and you'd be a bit like a person in the modern world who only owns one single color hoodie. The footwear was equally simple, leather sandals or bare feet. You'd be walking on uneven, dusty, and often dirty ground, and your feet would quickly become calloused and sore. Remember those animal droppings from section 1? Yeah, you'd be stepping in them. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Greeks used a type of perfume made from crushed flowers and herbs, not just for masking body odor but also for their hair and beards. It was a way to show a bit of flair and sophistication in a world of very limited fashion choices. You'd be smelling of rose petals and mint, while the person next to you might reek of garlic and sweat. It's a bit like a modern person wearing an expensive cologne while also needing a shower, a strange contrast that would be a regular part of life. The concept of dressing up was less about a different style of clothing and more about the quality of the fabric or the dye. A wealthy Greek might have a chiton made of finely woven linen, dyed a deep, vibrant purple, a color so rare and expensive that it was a clear sign of high status. You'd also see men with elaborate beards and hairstyles, as these were a very important part of a man's identity. The philosophers were known for their long, flowing beards, while a young man might be clean-shaven or have a short, trimmed beard. Historians still argue whether the Greek fashion for draped clothing was a matter of comfort and climate or if it was a deliberate rejection of the more tailored and complex garments of their Eastern neighbors. The simplicity of their clothes was a statement in itself, a testament to their love of practicality and their disdain for what they saw as ostentatious foreign fripperies. You'd quickly find that the lack of buttons, zippers, and pockets is a major inconvenience. You'd be carrying your few possessions, maybe a small pouch of coins, a wax tablet for notes, or a scroll, in a simple bag or tucked into your belt. Losing something would be a regular occurrence. as would trying to repin your chitin after it came undone. You'd get a small pinprick in your shoulder and you'd have to find a corner to refasten your garment. It's not exactly a fashion emergency, but it's a minor annoyance that you would face every single day. The sun beats down on you, and while the light fabric of your chitin is a relief, you can still feel the dust and grime clinging to your skin. You're a long way from the convenience of a closet full of clothes. And you've learned that in this world, simplicity is both a blessing and a curse. Your journey through the simple, dusty streets continues. You've had your meager meal. You're dressed in your uninspired tunic. And now you begin to take in your surroundings more closely. You quickly notice a mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greek homes were a far cry from the spacious, private dwellings you're used to. They were typically small, simple, and made of sun-dried mud bricks and wood, with a roof of terracotta tiles. Think of them less as houses and more as functional, one-story boxes. You would likely be living in a home with a small, enclosed courtyard at its center, a space for domestic tasks and a bit of open air. Windows were often small, high up, and covered with wooden shutters, not glass, making the interiors dark and stuffy. The lack of privacy is jarring. The entire family, and sometimes more, would live in these cramped quarters. You'd be sleeping on a mat on the floor, and the sounds and smells of your family, their daily routines, and their animals, for the more rural-minded, would be a constant presence. There was no concept of a man cave or a separate bedroom for everyone. This was communal living at its most basic. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in many homes, the main room was also the kitchen, and the smoke from the cooking fire, with no chimney, would simply escape through a hole in the roof. You can imagine the constant haze of smoke and the smell of cooking oil clinging to everything. A bit like a permanent campfire in your living room. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of Greek housing was a reflection of their belief in public life over private comfort, or if it was simply an economic necessity. The grand public buildings like the Parthenon were an expression of collective wealth and civic pride, a stark contrast to the modest homes where people lived. As you walk through the streets, you notice the public spaces are where the real action happens. The agora, the marketplace, is the heart of the city. It's loud, crowded, and full of energy. You see vendors selling everything from pottery to vegetables, and you hear the chatter of men debating politics and philosophy. There are no private cafes or secluded shopping malls. All commerce, all social interaction, all gossip, happens right here, in the open. It's a bit like living in a world where your only social outlet is a giant town square. Your modern need for personal space and private time would be completely unfulfilled. Even the public toilets, which were little more than stone benches with holes, were a communal affair. There's a subtle joke in the air, a kind of shared understanding that life is lived outside. You'd probably see a man talking to a friend with an intense, animated expression, while a few feet away, a couple of donkeys are tied up, braying loudly. It's a sensory cacophony, a jumble of sounds, smells, and sights that you would never experience in a modern city. The public fountains are where you'd get your water. The public baths are where you'd clean yourself. And the public square is where you'd meet and talk. Your home is just a place to sleep and store your very few belongings. The idea of home as a sanctuary, a place of personal retreat, is a luxury that you'd have to forget. You find yourself in a friend's modest home, and you can't help but feel a bit claustrophobic. The walls are bare, the furniture is sparse, and the entire space feels like it's built for function, not comfort. The flickering light of the lamp casts long shadows, and you can hear the sounds of your host's family moving around in the dark. It's a clear reminder that you're just a temporary visitor, a person whose modern expectations for privacy and personal space are utterly out of place here. As you navigate the cramped streets and public spaces, you begin to understand that your place in this world isn't determined by your personality or your achievements, but by a very strict and unbending social hierarchy. The most mainstream historical fact you'll learn is that ancient Greek society was divided into three main classes: citizens, foreigners, metoikoi, and slaves. You are, by birthright, a foreigner. This means you have no political rights. You can't own land, and you have to pay a special tax just for the privilege of living here. You're a second-class citizen in a world where being a citizen is everything. You'd quickly notice that the citizens, free men born in the city-state, are the ones who gather in the agora. who debate in the assembly, and who hold all the power. They are the ones with the loud, confident voices. You are a silent observer, a person who can listen to the philosophical debates but can never participate in them. This is a very subtle form of social exclusion, a quiet, constant reminder that you are not one of them. It's a bit like being at a party where you don't speak the language and no one else does either. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even within the citizen class, there were strict social divisions based on wealth and family lineage. A man from an old, established family, even if he wasn't rich, would be held in higher esteem than a man who had recently become wealthy through trade. It's a very old school kind of snobbery, a bit like a modern day person with an old, respected family name looking down on someone who just won the lottery. This obsession with heritage meant that you couldn't just make it in the way we understand it today. Your social standing was largely determined at birth. Historians still argue whether the Greek system of social stratification was a necessary foundation for their political stability or a self-serving mechanism designed to maintain the power of the elite. As you stand on the outskirts of a group of debating men, you see a slave, a person with no rights or freedom, silently carrying a heavy load. This is the third pillar of their society, the group upon which all of their leisured and philosophical pursuits are built. A joke in this world might be about a man who thinks he's an intellectual because he owns a single papyrus scroll. It highlights the subtle social distinctions and the importance of things like education and wealth. Even within this strict system, you would feel the weight of this hierarchy every single day. When you walk down the street, people would know who you are just by the way you carry yourself, the clothes you wear, and the work you do. You would be constantly aware of your place, a place that is not at the top. The lack of social mobility is a real shock to your modern sensibilities. You can't just work your way up the corporate ladder, because there is no corporate ladder. You are what you are, and you will stay that way. You can't vote, you can't hold public office, and you can't own a piece of the land you're standing on. You are a permanent guest, and a very heavily taxed one at that. It's a fundamental reality check, a realization that the freedom and opportunity you take for granted in your own world are not universal truths. You might be able to find work, maybe as an artisan or a merchant, but you will never be a part of the true inner circle. You're always on the outside looking in, a silent witness to a society that thrives on a system of haves and have-nots. Having come to terms with your own social standing, you begin to observe the lives of those around you more closely. And you quickly notice a stark difference in how men and women live. The most mainstream historical fact about the role of women in ancient Greece is that they were, for the most part, confined to the domestic sphere. A respectable woman's life was centered around the home, and her primary duties were to manage the household, bear children, and raise them. This wasn't just a cultural norm, it was a deeply ingrained expectation. The idea of a woman engaging in public life, going to the agora to shop or talk politics, would have been considered scandalous. A woman's freedom was, quite literally, defined by the walls of her home. You'd notice that you almost never see a citizen woman on her own in the streets. They were either at home, or, if they had to go out, they would be escorted and often veiled. This was a clear sign of their status and a very visual way of showing that they were not to be engaged with by other men. It's a bit like a modern celebrity trying to go to the grocery store in disguise. This seclusion was so important that the men's and women's quarters in a home were often separate, with a different entrance for each. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that while most women were secluded, there were exceptions. For example, the priestesses of some cults, like the one at Delphi, held immense power and influence. They were considered the voice of the gods, and even the most powerful men in Greece would come to them for advice. This created a strange and contradictory reality where women could hold divine authority but had no political power in their own society. Historians still argue whether this separation was a deliberate way to keep women in a subordinate role or if it was a system designed to protect them from the dangers of the outside world. Maybe it was a little bit of both. You would also learn that a woman's value was largely tied to her ability to produce male heirs. The family line was everything, and a woman who could not have children, or who had only daughters, was often a source of great shame and sorrow. This created a lot of pressure, a kind of unspoken competition among women that you would be able to feel in every interaction. A joke might be about a man who names his first daughter, Last Hope, because he desperately wants a son. It's a dark kind of humor that speaks to the high stakes of their societal roles. As a woman in this world, your opportunities would be virtually non-existent. You couldn't own property, couldn't vote, and couldn't even sue someone in court without a male guardian acting on your behalf. You were a legal and social dependent, a person whose life was controlled by her father, then her husband, and, if you were unlucky enough to outlive him, your son. The idea of a career or a personal life outside the family unit would be completely foreign. Your world would be the home, and your most important relationships would be with your children and your servants. You are a crucial part of the social fabric, a pillar of the household, but you are also a prisoner. You might be making clothes, cooking meals, and managing the household, but you are doing so from behind a very real and very visible wall. With the rigid social structure now clear, you begin to see how knowledge and learning fit into this world. Your modern education, a wide-ranging curriculum of math, science, literature, and history, would be almost unrecognizable here. The most mainstream historical fact about ancient Greek education is that it was not universal and was primarily reserved for the sons of citizens. For a boy, education began at home with his mother and nurse until about the age of 7. After that, he was sent to a private school where he would learn the fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic. This wasn't about standardized tests or report cards. It was about memorization and recitation. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the education of a boy was split into two parts: a grammatistes, who taught reading and writing, and a kitharistes, who taught music and poetry. The music part wasn't just about learning to play an instrument, it was about learning to appreciate and create poetry. As rhythm and meter were considered essential to a well-rounded mind. This was a very different kind of art class. A third teacher, the paidoribes, would focus on physical training, or gymnastics, because the development of the body was seen as just as important as the development of the mind. This was all about creating a well-rounded citizen, a person who was not only intelligent but also physically capable of defending the city-state. For girls, the educational path was almost non-existent. They did not attend school and were taught at home by their mothers. Their education was practical and domestic. They would learn to spin, weave, cook, and manage a household. The idea of a girl learning to read and write was rare and often associated with a lower social class, like that of a hetera, or courtesan, who needed to be educated to attract and hold the attention of wealthy and influential men. Historians still argue whether the lack of formal education for women was a deliberate effort to keep them subservient or a reflection of the societal belief that their roles did not require such learning. You would find the focus of their education to be much narrower than what you're used to. There was no chemistry class, no biology lab, and no computer science. Instead, the focus was on rhetoric, philosophy, and history. The goal was not to create an innovator or a scientist, but a persuasive and well-spoken public servant. A joke in this society might be about a man who boasts of his vast knowledge of mathematics but can't carry on a decent conversation. It would highlight the value they placed on social and rhetorical skills over pure academic knowledge. Your modern knowledge, while vast in scope, would be of little use in this context. You might know all about the theory of relativity, but it wouldn't help you win a debate in the agora. You could try to explain the concept of a computer, but they would probably just think you were talking about some kind of strange new abacus. Your own education, a product of a world that values individual achievement and specialization, would be seen as a strange curiosity. You'd be a walking encyclopedia of useless facts, a person who knows everything about nothing that matters in this world. And as you try to explain the concept of a library, a place where all of this information is stored, they would probably just look at you with polite confusion. The only libraries they knew were the minds of the great thinkers and the oral traditions passed down from one generation to the next. With your mind reeling from the limitations of Greek education, you start to consider the practicalities of survival. How would you earn a living in a world without corporations, computers, or even currency in the way you know it? The most mainstream historical fact about the Greek economy is that it was primarily based on agriculture and trade. The vast majority of people were farmers, and you would likely be one of them. You'd be working the fields, planting grain, tending to olive trees, or harvesting grapes. This wasn't a 9-to-5 job with weekends off, it was a constant. back-breaking struggle against the elements. Your workday would begin at dawn and end at dusk, and your life would be dictated by the seasons. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Greeks had a very specific word, ponos, which meant a kind of physical hardship or grueling labor. It was a respected part of life, and the philosophers would often talk about the value of ponos in building character. This was a world that valued honest, physical labor, not the kind of abstract, cerebral work you might be used to. This is a society where a man's worth was often measured by the calluses on his hands. It's a bit like a modern tech worker trying to explain their job to a person who only understands farming. You'd probably get a blank stare. For those who didn't farm, there were other options. You could be an artisan, a potter, a sculptor, or a metal worker. These were highly skilled professions, and the best artisans were respected and often wealthy. You could also be a merchant, traveling by ship to trade goods with other city-states. But this was a dangerous and unpredictable business, with the constant threat of pirates, shipwrecks, and bad weather. Historians still argue whether the Greek invention of coinage was a natural evolution of trade or a deliberate act by the ruling class to centralize economic power. This small piece of metal, a coin with a city's emblem stamped on it, was a revolutionary concept that made trade and commerce so much easier. There's a subtle joke you would hear in the marketplace, a kind of dark humor about the unpredictable nature of work. A merchant might complain that the gods have cursed his ship with bad winds, or a farmer would lament a sudden drought. There was a constant sense of being at the mercy of forces beyond your control. Whether it was the weather, the gods, or the whims of a powerful politician. This isn't a world of predictable salaries and paid vacation days. It's a world of feast or famine. Your modern skills would be utterly useless here. You can't code your way out of a drought. You can't use a spreadsheet to track your inventory. You are a person whose primary value comes from what you can do with your hands, and your ability to endure hardship. The idea of work-life balance would be a laughable concept. Work was life, and life was work. You are a part of a system that has been in place for centuries. A system that values tradition and stability over innovation and progress. As you see a man hammering a piece of bronze, his muscles rippling with every strike, you realize that your modern, desk-bound life would be a source of great shame here. You'd be seen as a weak, useless person, a person who has never truly worked a day in their life. Your back aches from the lack of a proper mattress, and you realize that even a small illness could be a death sentence here. You are now confronted with the reality of ancient medicine. A mainstream historical fact is that the Greeks had a limited understanding of anatomy and disease. They believed that health was a matter of balancing four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it was because these humors were out of balance, and the treatments were designed to restore that balance. You could have a fever, and a doctor would tell you it was because you had too much blood. The cure would be to have a leech suck some of it out. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky faucet by pouring more water into the sink. A quirky or fringe tidbit you would learn is that for more serious ailments, people would go to a healing sanctuary dedicated to the god of medicine. Asclepius, you would sleep in the sanctuary, and the god would come to you in your dreams and tell you how to get better. This was a very popular form of medicine, a blend of religion, psychology, and folk remedies. It was a place where hope was just as important as the cure. Imagine a modern doctor telling you to go to bed and hope a god tells you what to do. You'd probably get a second opinion. Historians still argue whether the dream healing at these sanctuaries was a form of placebo effect or if the priests were providing subtle medical advice that was attributed to the gods. The medical toolkit was also very different. There were no antibiotics, no painkillers, and no sterile surgical instruments. If you had a bad toothache, the dentist would probably just pull it out with a pair of pliers. If you had a deep wound, they would clean it with wine and then sew it up with a simple thread. The death rate from infection alone was incredibly high. A joke you might hear would be a man saying he'd rather fight a Persian than see a surgeon. It's a bit of gallows humor that speaks to the real and present dangers of a simple cut or scrape. The treatments were often strange and sometimes even dangerous. For a headache, you might have a hole drilled into your skull to let out the evil spirits. A practice called trephining. This was not a fun procedure. You would probably prefer a headache. The idea of a simple, Over-the-counter painkiller would be a miracle. The absence of sanitation, from Section 2, also meant that disease was rampant. You'd be living in close quarters with people who had no concept of germs. And a simple cold could turn into a life-threatening illness. You'd be constantly aware of your own mortality, a feeling that is almost completely absent from modern life. Your own body, a thing you take for granted, would be a constant source of worry. You would probably have a little bag of good luck charms with you at all times. Because in this world, luck is just as important as medicine. With a newfound respect for modern medicine, you turn your attention to the lighter side of life. How did the Greeks relax and entertain themselves? The most mainstream historical fact is that entertainment was a communal and often public affair. The most famous form of entertainment was the theater. The Greeks loved their drama, and a trip to the theater was a major event. It wasn't just about watching a play, it was a religious and civic experience. You'd be sitting in a massive, open-air amphitheater, with thousands of other people, watching a tragedy or a comedy unfold. The actors wore masks to convey emotion, and the performances were often accompanied by a chorus that would dance and sing. It's a bit like a modern-day rock concert, a combination of music, performance, and a shared experience. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Greeks had a special kind of performance called a satyr play, which was a short, comical play that was performed after 3 tragedies. It was a way to lighten the mood, a bit like a modern-day stand-up comedy special after a very long and serious movie marathon. The satyr plays were often raunchy and full of slapstick humor, a stark contrast to the serious tragedies that preceded them. Historians still argue whether the satyr plays were a necessary part of the theatrical experience or a purely commercial decision to keep the audience entertained. Another major form of entertainment was the Olympic Games. This wasn't just a sporting event, it was a festival in honor of Zeus. The games were held every 4 years, and they were a big deal. The events were a bit different from what you're used to. They included foot races, discus and javelin throws, wrestling, boxing, and a brutal, no-holds-barred fight called the pancration, which was a mix of wrestling and boxing. The athletes competed naked, and the winner received not a medal, but a wreath of olive leaves and a lifetime of glory. There were no runners-up. You either won, or you didn't. This was not a world of participation trophies. A joke you might hear would be a man complaining about his son's bad performance in a race, saying, "He ran so slowly, a snail would have beaten him." It's a simple, universal kind of humor that transcends time and culture. You'd find that the Greeks loved to talk, to debate, and to tell stories. The art of conversation was a form of entertainment in itself. You'd spend your evenings in the company of friends, drinking watered-down wine and talking for hours about philosophy, politics, and the latest gossip. It's a very social kind of entertainment, a far cry from a world of solitary screen time. You would quickly realize that you had to be a part of the action, not just a passive observer. This was not a world of binge watching. It was a world of shared, live experiences. The entertainment and laughter of the theater fades, and you are left to ponder the deeper, more spiritual side of Greek life. You've already seen how religion is a part of everything, from the public festivals to the healing sanctuaries. The most mainstream historical fact about ancient Greek religion is that it was polytheistic, with a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses who controlled every aspect of life. You'd be living in a world where you would constantly be trying to appease and honor a dozen different deities, each with their own unique personality and power. Zeus, the king of the gods, was in charge of the sky and thunder. Poseidon controlled the sea and earthquakes, and Hades ruled the underworld. There was a god for almost everything, from war to love to the harvest. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Greeks believed that the gods had very human flaws. They were jealous, vindictive, and prone to fits of rage. They would meddle in the lives of mortals, and their petty squabbles could have devastating consequences. This made for a very different kind of religious experience, one that was less about a loving, benevolent creator and more about a group of powerful, capricious beings who you had to constantly manage. It's a bit like living in a world where your boss is a powerful, moody teenager who can fire you for no reason at all. Historians still argue whether the Greek myths were seen as literal truths or as allegorical stories meant to teach a moral lesson. Were the Greeks really afraid of being struck by lightning for making Zeus angry? Or was it a convenient metaphor for the unpredictability of life? Your daily life would be filled with rituals and offerings. You would have a small altar in your home, where you would leave small offerings of food or wine to your favorite gods. Before you started a journey, you would make an offering to Hermes, the god of travelers. Before you planted your crops, you would make an offering to Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. You would always be aware of the god's presence. In every sunrise and every thunderstorm, a joke might be about a farmer who blames his bad harvest on a lazy god who was sleeping on the job. It's a kind of coping mechanism, a way to deal with the overwhelming power and unpredictability of the divine. The fear of divine retribution was a very real and constant threat. If a plague swept through the city, it was because a god was angry. If an army was defeated in battle, it was because the gods had turned their backs on the city. You would be constantly trying to stay on their good side, a difficult task since their motives were often so mysterious. The idea of a single, all-powerful, and benevolent God would be a strange and foreign concept. You would be a part of a much more chaotic and vibrant spiritual world. A world where the gods were just as messy and complicated as the mortals who worshipped them. As you watch a man pour a libation of wine onto a small altar, you realize that this is not just a religious act, but a part of his daily routine, a constant conversation with the forces that govern his world. Having navigated the spiritual landscape, you are brought back to the brutal realities of ancient Greek life. The constant threat of war is an ever-present shadow. The most mainstream historical fact about the Greek military is that it was primarily composed of citizen soldiers called hoplites. If you were a citizen, which, you'll remember, you're not, you would be expected to serve in the army. A duty that was considered a fundamental part of being a man. This wasn't a choice, it was a societal expectation. The hoplites were named after their distinctive shield. The hoplon, a heavy, round shield made of wood and bronze. They fought in a formation called the phalanx, a tightly packed unit of men shoulder to shoulder, their shields interlocking to form a solid wall of bronze. It's a bit like a modern-day football huddle, but with spears and a lot more at stake. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might learn is that before a battle, some hoplites would engrave their names on their shields. Not just their names, but often a short poem or a prayer to the gods. It was a kind of ancient warrior signature, a way of leaving a mark on the battlefield, and a way of hoping that their name would be remembered. Historians still argue whether the phalanx was a truly effective military formation or if its success was more a matter of psychological intimidation. The idea of a solid wall of men with spears was certainly terrifying. But it was also a very slow and inflexible formation. The military equipment itself was a heavy, cumbersome burden. The helmet, a bronze masterpiece that covered your face and head, was hot, heavy, and severely restricted your vision and hearing. You would be carrying a spear, a sword, and a shield that weighed up to 15 pounds. This wasn't a quick skirmish, it was a brutal, slow-motion ballet of violence. A joke you might hear would be about a soldier who ran so fast that his armor was still a mile back. It's a kind of dark humor that speaks to the physical demands of war. Military service was not just about fighting, it was about discipline, endurance, and camaraderie. You would spend months away from home, training and marching with your fellow soldiers. You would be part of a unit that was as close as a family. And your life would depend on the man next to you. The fear of death was real, but the fear of being seen as a coward was often greater. This was a world where honor was everything. As a foreigner, you wouldn't be expected to serve, but you would still be a part of the war machine. You would be a part of the supporting cast, the people who would provide food, supplies, and services to the soldiers. You would be watching the soldiers march out of the city, and you would be waiting for them to return, a mix of hope and dread in your heart. You would be a silent witness to a very brutal and bloody business. A person who is spared from the fighting but not from the consequences. The glory of war would be for the citizens, but the suffering would be for everyone. You would learn that in this world, there is no escape from the reality of conflict. It is a constant presence, a cloud that hangs over every decision and every celebration. You've seen the military, the economy, and the social classes, and now you must confront the way this society maintains order. What happens when someone breaks a rule? The most mainstream historical fact about ancient Greek law is that it was a very public and often brutal affair. The concept of a modern, Professional lawyer was non-existent. Instead, a person would have to plead their own case in court, in front of a jury of hundreds, or even thousands, of their fellow citizens. This was a direct form of justice, a very hands-on approach to the legal system. The outcome of a trial was not just a matter of law, it was also a matter of rhetoric, of persuasion, and of public opinion. It's a bit like a modern-day trial by social media, but with much higher stakes. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some cases, the dead could also be put on trial. If a statue or an inanimate object was responsible for a death, it would be tried and, if found guilty, banished from the city. This was a very strange and almost ritualistic form of justice, a way to restore order and purity to the community. Historians still argue whether this was a truly held belief in the inanimate object's guilt or if it was a symbolic way to deal with the trauma of a sudden death. The punishments were often harsh and swift. If you were found guilty of a crime, you could be fined, banished from the city, or even executed. There was no concept of a long prison sentence. A person was either a productive member of society or a threat to it. And the legal system was designed to deal with that threat quickly and decisively. A joke might be about a man who tried to argue his case in court, only to be found guilty because he wore the wrong color tunic. It would highlight the arbitrary nature of a system that relied so heavily on public perception and personal charisma. Your modern understanding of innocent until proven guilty would be completely alien here. In many cases, the burden of proof was on the accused, and if you couldn't prove your innocence, you were guilty. The idea of a fair trial, with equal access to legal representation and a jury of your peers, was a luxury reserved for the most powerful. As a foreigner, you would be even more vulnerable. You would not have the right to a public trial, and your case would likely be heard by a much smaller, and less forgiving, group of officials. You would be constantly aware of the fact that your freedom and your life were a fragile thing. A thing that could be taken away at any moment for the smallest of infractions. The legal system was not a safety net, it was a tightrope. And a single misstep could send you plummeting to your doom. You've seen the daily grind, the social rules, and the constant threats, and now you come to the final, and perhaps most famous, aspect of ancient Greek life, politics and philosophy. The most mainstream historical fact about this era is that it was the birthplace of democracy. The word itself, demokratia, means rule by the people. This wasn't a representative democracy like we have today, it was a direct democracy. If you were a citizen, and again, you're not, you would have the right to attend the assembly, to speak your mind, and to vote on every single law. It's a very hands-on and very time-consuming form of government. A far cry from simply casting a ballot every few years. The idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people was born here, in a world where only a very small percentage of the population was considered the people. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Greeks had a practice called ostracism. Once a year, the citizens of Athens could vote to banish a person from the city for 10 years. The vote was cast on a piece of pottery, or ostracon, and the person with the most votes was out. This wasn't a punishment for a crime, it was a way to deal with a person who was seen as being too powerful or too ambitious. It was a kind of political time-out, a way to prevent anyone from becoming a tyrant. Historians still argue whether ostracism was an effective way to maintain political stability or if it was simply a tool for the powerful to eliminate their rivals. But the most enduring legacy of ancient Greece is its philosophy. You would see men walking in the agora, arguing about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and the best way to live. These were not abstract, academic debates, they were a part of daily life. The great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle weren't just writing books, they were teaching, talking, and living their philosophy. The idea that you could use reason and logic to understand the world was a revolutionary concept. A joke you might hear would be a man saying he's a philosopher because he can't make a living doing anything else. It's a kind of gentle, self-deprecating humor that shows that even the most high-minded pursuits were still a part of a very grounded and practical world. You would be a silent observer of all of this. A person who can see the birth of some of the most profound ideas in human history but can't participate in them. You would be a witness to a world that is both incredibly advanced and incredibly primitive. You would see a culture that created some of the most beautiful art and some of the most brutal warfare. You would see a people who invented democracy but relied on slavery to make it work. It's a world of contradictions. A world that is both a blueprint for our own and a cautionary tale. And as the day ends and the sounds of the city begin to fade, you find yourself ready to rest, your mind filled with the strange and wonderful paradoxes of a world that is so far away. And yet, in a way, so close. The lessons of ancient Greece are not just about what they achieved, but about what it cost them. The air has grown still, and the flickering light of the clay lamp is the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay. The sounds of the city have gone quiet, and all you can hear is the soft rustle of the wind through a nearby olive tree. You've seen and felt so much in this strange new world, the grit of the dirt, the smell of the market, the feel of the rough linen tunic against your skin. The sheer physical and mental effort of simply existing here has been exhausting. A constant reminder of how much we take for granted. Let the images of the public baths, the simple meals, and the crowded assembly fade. Feel the weight of the hoplites shield lift from your shoulders. The debates, the laws, and the daily struggles, they are all a part of a story that happened long, long ago. Let your breath become slow and even. Allow the details to become soft and blurred. Like an old, faded photograph. You are safe. You are warm. The world you left behind is still there, waiting for you in the morning. For now, just drift away.